And I looked at him and I said to him, he wants me to go to that apartment and throw a woman and a child out into the street. And he thinks we're going to clip him. And he sends word to me that he went to the FBI, and if anything happens to him, they know it came from me. Johnny Alite committed homicides for him. Johnny Alite was his right-hand man. He told John that if you go near this girl again, I'm going to chop your fucking head off. So when he does these interviews, he has to be careful of what he talks about because he don't have coverage. If his father shelved him, I believe I would have heard about that a long time ago. Hi, I'm Anthony Ruggiano Jr. of Reformed Gangsters, and today I'm going to talk about the John Gotti Jr. Patrick Bet David interview. But first, I want to tie in my family, the Ruggiano family, with the Gotti family because we have a long history together. I'm not here to bash John Gotti Jr. or make enemies of him or start a war of words between them. I'm going to just talk about my relationship with the Gottis and their relationship with the Ruggianos and what I think of the interview and my opinion and the intimate stories and knowledge I have of our lives in Ozone Park. The Gotti family goes back to the early 50s when John Gotti Sr. was a teenager in East New York. My father, Fat Andy, was a made member of the Mafia, of the Gambino family. That's when he met John Gotti Jr., because John Gotti Sr. is really John Gotti Jr., but that's another story. So anyway, that's where the relationship started, when John Gotti Sr. was a kid, a teenager, running the streets. Nicky Carrazza, who became a boss in the Gambino family, was with Fat Andy, my father, and John Gotti and him beefed, and John Gotti went with Charlie Wagons, who actually was the member of the Gambino family that proposed my father, Fat Andy, and later on proposed John Gotti Sr. So they were both brought into the Mafia by the same made member, Charlie. So that's the first connection that I had. When I was 16, I got into the life. I started working for my father in crap games and poker games. John Gotti Jr. was just a kid. That's when I met his father. When I was about 13, I had met John Gotti Sr. and started developing a relationship with him. As I got older and started working in the Mafia, in dice games and all that stuff, and selling swag and committing a lot of crimes, John Gotti Jr. was in military school. So he wasn't really a criminal at that point like I was. I was already out there getting arrested, working in mob-controlled organizations, working in number offices and doing the things that Italian kids in the mob did at that time, which today, all those jobs and all that is gone. I mean, no Italian kids write numbers no more. They don't even probably know what it is because the government took over everything, the lottery, the gambling, the marijuana. So it's a whole different world out there now. What I'm going to talk about now is things that transpired after John Gotti Jr. got into the life and became a made member. So in 1988, on Christmas Eve of 1988, we had a guy that was with us named Dominic Pizzoni, Skinny Dom, who Tony Lee and my father, Fat Andy, proposed, who I actually committed a murder with. And on Christmas Eve, that's when the ceremonies used to take place. So John Gotti was the boss. It was Christmas Eve of 1988, and waiting for Skinny Dom to come back from the ceremony to have a drink with him to celebrate being made. I wasn't drinking at the time. Actually, not to change the subject, but today I have 36 years clean and sober. So I was clean already, and I'm saying that because I know if John Gotti Jr. sees this video or his sister Angel sees this video, they may not be happy with it, and they may start calling me names like coke fiend and rat, and so I'm going to put that out there. I was not using cocaine at the time. I'm at Richie Gotti's Cafe, which was around the corner from the Burger Hut and Fish Club. Skinny Dom comes in, we congratulate him, and John Gotti Jr. comes in, and everybody's congratulating him, and I didn't even know he was proposed, and I turned around to Tony Lee, and I said to Tony Lee, did he get straightened out? And Tony Lee told me yes. I listened to his interview. Him and I had a similar childhood. He didn't know what his father did for a living. He just knew his father got treated special, but he knew things were different. And I experienced the same thing. I just knew when he walked in a room in a restaurant, the atmosphere changed and he was treated different. And I didn't live like the kids on my block. Like, it was different in my house. The way we lived was different. And John Gotti Jr. experienced that same thing that I did, because when he talked about that in the interview, I totally identified with that. His father reached the pinnacle. I mean, his father became a boss. You know, that's the top of the mountain. But they were both bigger than life. And I wouldn't say we were friends. We were acquaintances. We respected each other. I was more friends with his right-hand man, Johnny Alite. I know he's always bashing Johnny Alite, but Johnny Alite was his right-hand man. Johnny Alite did commit homicides on his behalf. I mean, you know, Johnny Alite did put together a major drug business that he had a piece of. You know, so he could say whatever he wants, but Johnny Alite was his right-hand man. And how I know that, I know Johnny Alite since he was a little kid. My brother, Albert, was actually Johnny Alite's baseball coach when he was a teenager. So we go back a long way. So that was his right-hand man. I look at the interview and, you know, he tries to play the victim, and he wasn't a victim. I had this kid around us named Johnny Halpin. He was in recovery, and he met a woman, and he moved in with her. She had a little girl. They lived together, and he had a job, and Johnny Halpin relapsed on drugs and stopped paying his rent. I didn't know at the time that John Gotti Jr. owned this building, but everybody knew Johnny Halpin was with us. He was on record with us. I'm in the club one day, and one of John Gotti Jr.'s guys come to the club and tells me, listen, John wants you to go and throw Johnny Halpin's girl out of that apartment because they haven't paid the rent in months. And I looked at him and I said to him, he wants me to go to that apartment and throw a woman and a child out into the street? I'm not doing it. I'm not going to do that. Well, Johnny Halpin's with you. I said, what does that woman have to do with it? He hasn't paid. I said, I'm not doing it. I'm not throwing no woman and child in the street. Tell him if he wants them in the street, let him throw them in the street. He goes, that's what you want me to tell him? I said, yeah. So he goes back to the Bergen Hut and Fish Club. Now, I find this out later on. So in the Bergen Hut and Fish Club, when he went back there, was a guy named Tony Pep, Anthony Costa, who was a made member of the mob, who actually Tony Lee and my father, Fat Andy, proposed, and he got made. A major player. He was in the Bergen Hut and Fish Club when this kid came back and told John Jr. what had happened. John Jr. got upset and got up and actually was going to come back to the club and berate me and maybe even like try to hit me or whatever he wanted to do. And Tony Pep told him, listen, don't go back to that club and put your hands on that kid, because he's not going to just stand there and let you hit him. So, you know, if you go there and you do that, it's going to be a big thing, even though, you know, your father is the boss. And he thought about it and he didn't come there. And if he did and he would have put his hands on me, it would have been a big thing. It would have been really a big thing. I went to meet with the woman. I bought her some time. She eventually moved out of the apartment, didn't have to pay the money back. And in the interim, Johnny Halpin gets wind of this. Now Johnny Halpin thinks we're going to clip him, because now he knows this all transpired through the neighborhood, and he thinks we're going to clip him. And he sends word to me that he went to the FBI, and if anything happens to him, they know it came from me. That's what kind of people we were. You know, we were bad people. Junior was a bad guy. I was a bad guy. You know, he was a criminal. I was a criminal. I was more hands-on than him. He had people bringing him money. I was more hands-on. He profited. Whether anybody got locked up or not, once you profit, you're out of the mob. You're labeled a rat. Whether you consider yourself that or not, that's neither here nor there. Once a guy in the mob meets with the government, you're out. That's it. You cooperated. There's no two ways about it. Once you proffer, that's it. Now, he's got to be careful, because when you proffer or when you cooperate, you have to tell them about every crime you ever committed, whether you got locked up for it or not. And the crimes you don't get locked up for, you get what they call coverage. Coverage is that when you testify or when you talk about it, you can't be charged with them crimes. It doesn't matter what they are, murder, extortion. It doesn't matter what the crime is. Once you get coverage, you can't get charged. Guys like John Jr. they don't have coverage. So when he does these interviews, he has to be careful of what he talks about because he don't have coverage. So there was an incident in my neighborhood on Jamaica Avenue. A guy got stabbed and died. John Gotti Jr. allegedly was the guy that stabbed him. He oinked like a pig. That night, we had a guy around us named Sharial, who was with Fat Andy and Tony Lee. He had major connections with the New York PD, with political connections. He was our go-to guy when it came to fixing things or anything. He was our go-to guy. He was with us. After the incident on Jamaica Avenue and the kid gets killed, John Gotti Sr. gets Tony Lee out of bed. They go get Sharial out of bed, and they fix the whole thing. And it goes away. There's a kid named Sinamo, I believe his name was. He was in the bar with a girl named Phyllis. Phyllis was my father's goddaughter. Phyllis was the daughter of this guy named Freddie Hott, who later became a made guy. A rumor starts that this kid was going to talk to the cops. The next thing you know, there's a suicide note, I believe, and the kid is found dead with an alleged suicide. It was not a suicide. He was murdered. It was made to look like a suicide. So now 2 people lost their lives over this incident. In the 302, which I'll get to later, he mentions the connections with Tony Lee, with the law enforcement. He mentions Angelo Quack and Joe Watts committed the murder. So we were not good people. We were criminals. We were violent criminals. Whether we committed the act of violence or we let other people commit the act of violence, we weren't victims. We were criminals. John Gotti was in Greenhaven when the books were open. They had a connection in Greenhaven, and they got out on a furlough, him and Angelo Quack. And when they were out on a furlough, they had the ceremony. And then after the ceremony, they went back to Greenhaven to finish their sentence. And I had to go away at the same time they were out on the furlough. And the day I had to surrender, I went to Father and Son's barbershop to get a haircut. I was 24. I went to get a haircut. I guess I wanted to look good when I turned myself in. I don't know. And I'm in the barbershop. And who walks in? John Gotti and Angelo Quack. They walk into the barbershop and they see me. And John says to me, "What are you doing here? Don't you got to surrender today?" And I go, "Yeah, I got to go in at 2:00. He goes, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm getting a haircut." He goes, "Getting a haircut? Go home to your wife. What are you, crazy? You're going to jail this afternoon. Get out of here." So, and he actually then paid for my haircut, and we said goodbye, and I left. And then it's ironic because 2.5 years later, when I got out, I was home about 2 days, and I had to meet my father at the Ravenite, and it was the first time I was going to be going back to the Ravenite since I got out of prison. And when I went to the Ravenite and parked my car, the first person I saw standing outside the Ravenite was John, and, he hugged me and kissed me, and, we both walked back into the Ravenite together. So he actually got straightened out when he was on a furlough from Greenhaven State Prison. But, there was always a lot of friction because my father's main guy, Nicky Carrazza, and John Gotti were enemies, in the East New York. I guess they were around the same age. And, ego things, John Gotti had his crew and Nicky had his crew. And they actually had fist fights and beefs. And once John hit on my father's girlfriend, I don't know if he knew it was my father's girlfriend or not, but he had hit on my father's girlfriend because, we were all womanizers. That's how we lived. We had wives and girlfriends. That was a mob thing. They had to sit down with Charlie because Charlie was afraid that my father was going to hurt John, and they had to sit down, and my father told John, John was a kid, he told John that if you go near this girl again, I'm going to chop your fucking head off. And my father, that was my father's favorite saying. He would, when he got mad at somebody, he would tell them, "If you keep it up, I'm going to chop your fucking head off." It was just like a phrase he used. I'm sure he would have, and that was like a little sit down they had, but they respected each other throughout the years. He starts off the interview talking about when he was a child. And like I said earlier, I completely identified with that. Unfortunately for John, his father was in prison when he was a kid, so he had to go visit his father in jail. I didn't have that experience as a child. My father got arrested a few times when I was a child and taken out of my house in handcuffs in front of me, but he never went to prison. So I never had that experience of visiting him in prison. But when I listened to the interview, I'm going to talk about the things I think were not true, because a lot of it was true and a lot of it was real. He sort of makes himself to be a victim. And, I want to say that out of all the people that talked about this interview, because everybody that has mob podcast had something to say about this interview, but I think what's unique about my story and Mikey Scars's story and Johnny Alite's story and Sammy the Bull's story is we had a relationship with these people. We knew these people. We interacted with these people. We committed crimes with these people. So our take on this interview is totally different than anybody else just watching it and commenting on it, because we have intimate knowledge, inside knowledge and intimate knowledge of what really transpired. So I'm just going to touch on the things that I think were in the gray area, let's say. I don't want to say he's a blatant liar, but, in the gray area. And first, it's about fixing juries. I actually fixed my father's jury. I paid a juror $25,000 and he hung the jury. Sammy the Bull, which I spoke to Sammy about this personally, paid a juror $65,000 to hang the jury. John claims that it was a unanimous not guilty verdict. And the reason why was because the juror that was paid convinced the jury that they were not guilty. That's the only way he would have got a not guilty verdict. If Sammy paid a guy $65,000 to fix the jury, the way he's going to fix the jury is only two ways. Either he's going to be the only holdout, which happened in my father's case. It was 11 guilties and one not guilty, which was the guy we paid $25,000 to. In John's case, I believe the juror that was paid $65,000, because I know Sammy paid the guy $65,000, because that's what we did. We always tried to get to juries, always, with money or intimidation. That's a fact. If a jury could be gotten to, we got to them. Sammy gave the guy $65,000. That guy did a great job, because he swung all those 11 people into not guilties. There might have been a couple of people that were going to come in not guilty anyway without this guy's persuasion, but the people that weren't going to come in with a not guilty, or the people that were on the fence, that guy did his job. He earned that $65,000, and he got locked up for that. And I believe he went to prison for that. So I believe that jury was fixed, whether John Jr. says it was or not. And I spoke to Sammy about that, and Sammy told me he paid the guy $65,000, and I believe Sammy. The second thing that sort of bothered me is when he said his father shelved him. Now, his father passed away, unfortunately, when he was in prison, and when I was in prison. And my father passed away, unfortunately, when I was in prison, and neither one of us got to attend our father's funeral because the federal government wouldn't allow us to. If his father shelved him, I believe I would have heard about that a long time ago, because that's the first time I ever heard that his father shelved him. I think that would have been all over the street. I would have definitely heard something like that long before it came out of his mouth. I don't believe for a minute his father shelved him. I think he got shelved after they found out he profited. He says that people said it was okay for him to profit. I find that hard to believe, that made guys would tell another made guy, especially a guy in his position, that it's okay to meet with the government, because that's a big no-no. You do not, anybody that meets with the government, that's the end of it. You're shelved, you're chased, you're killed, you're gone. Another thing is, what's funny is being the most persecuted person in America. And I'm not saying he wasn't persecuted, because he was, because of his name. But he's not alone. Listen, I was not on his level. Don't get me wrong. He was made, he became a captain. He sat on the panel. He ran the Gambino family with his Uncle Pete and Nicky Carrazza. They were on the panel. And yes, he was persecuted. There's no doubt about it. But he's not alone in that. I was persecuted because I was Fat Andy's son. I'll go through it briefly. In 1978, I got arrested. I went to trial. I got convicted with other guys. I go upstate to reception in Clinton, and it was reception. I'm waiting to get designated to a prison. My two co-defendants for this, now we're there for the same crime. We got convicted, found not guilty together at the same trial. They get sent to Camp Adirondacks, Camp Adirondacks. No fence, no wall. They were actually, it was in Lake Placid, New York, and the Winter Olympics were going to be there, and they actually built the things for the Winter Olympics. The Camp Adirondacks inmates worked on the Winter Olympics setup. Me, Anthony Ruggiano Jr., the son of Fat Andy, went to Comstock, which was nicknamed Gladiator School. I wonder why. Why did I go to Gladiator School and they went to Camp Adirondacks? I guess it was because I was Fat Andy's son. Every time I got arrested, I got the most time. I went to the worst prisons. I was always designated CMC, Central Monitoring Case, because I was Fat Andy's son. When I got out of prison, I was always on restrictive intensive supervision. Me and Vinny Gotti actually were on special parole. And the guide and our parole officer used to tell us that we were the stars of his caseload. Intensive restricted supervision. I couldn't fight without reporting it. He went on trial 3 times for the same charge. Fat Andy went on trial 3 times for the same charge. So was he persecuted? Definitely. But he's not alone in that. We were all persecuted. I was persecuted because who my father was, he was persecuted for his father was. And like I said, I'm not trying to compare myself with him. This is the life we led. And these are the things that happened to us. Parallel things happened to us. And other people's sons. Ali Boy Persico, he was persecuted because of who his father was, Carmine the Snake. The poor guy's doing life. Michael Franzese was persecuted because his father was Sonny Franzese. And I could go on and on and on about sons of wise guys that were persecuted for who their father was. But were we victims? I'll let you decide. I don't know if we were victims. I chose to get into that life. When I sat down with my father at my kitchen table at 16 years old, I had a choice. I could either went in a construction union, which was at my fingertips. I could have done that in a heartbeat. Or I could have went to work for Philly the Pimp in his blackjack game. And I chose Philly the Pimp. He had a choice. He was in military school. He could have went into the service, whatever he was doing in military school. He had a choice. He decided to get straightened out. So I don't believe we're victims. The interviewer, he's very intelligent, very articulated. He did a great job. He uses big words. He's very intelligent. I don't believe that he came out of jail broke. I mean, he can't admit, he said that he reinvented himself, which he did. He wrote a book when he got out. He reinvented himself because he profited. He had no choice. He was out of the mob. They shelved him. His father was the boss for a long time. Where's all the money? John, where's the money? Where's your father's money? I mean, your father was the boss. The money was coming in. How could anybody come home broke when their father was? I can't comprehend that. He had to come. Where is the money? Where's the money? Even when John Gotti Sr. was in jail, he was still the boss. He was never taken down as the boss. There was acting bosses, but he was the boss. He still got his end. Where's the money? So that's another thing I find hard, that he came home to no money. When he talked about they had a code, him and his father, when they thought he had a code and he left, they had a code. And now this was told to me by Nicky Carrazza. Now, Nicky Carrazza was proposed by Fat Andy and Tony Lee. He became a made member in the 70s when the books were opened. Later on, John made him a captain. Later on, there was a 3-member panel that ran the Gambino family for John Gotti when he was in Marion. And on the panel was Pete Gotti, who was a boob, Nicky Carrazza, who was a gangster, and John Gotti Jr. They ran the Gambino family, the 3 of them. They were on a 3-member panel. When Sammy the Bull flipped, they made a code in MCC so they could talk. They made a code. This way, if John got convicted, because they knew he was going to go to Marion, they knew he was going to go to a Supermax if he got convicted, and everything was going to be monitored. They made a code. Now, how do I know that? There was a lawyer involved with the code. I'm not going to say his name. He's still out there. He practices law. He knows who he is. I get proposed in the 90s. I'm talking to Nicky about when I'm going to get straightened out. He turns around and tells me he used to call John Jr. the kid. He says, well, the kid's going to go visit his father, and his father has to okay the list. So I look at Nicky and I go, his father's got to okay the list. How's he going to tell his father about the list? He's in Mariam. I know there's, he's behind a glass, he's in a glass case. I go, and I look at Nicky and I go, how's he going to okay the list? And Nicky says they have a code. And it's funny, when he said that in the interview about the code, I laughed because I know about the code. It was when he was on the panel running the Gambino family. From what I understand from Nicky, also, the Genovese family didn't want to recognize him as a boss or even as maybe a made member. And when they had dealings with the Genovese family, Nicky was the one that went to see Bonnie, who was the acting boss at the time of the Genovese family. And Nicky is the one that had a relationship with Bonnie. And how do I know all that is because I was with Nicky. Nicky was my co-defendant in Florida. We got indicted together. I knew Nicky since I was a little kid. So that's how I know all this from Nicky. Nicky and I used to have a lot of conversations together. Another thing he talked about, which is a touchy subject, and I really don't like to talk about it, but you have to. It's just it's a major event, and it's a major event is when his kid brother unfortunately got hit by the car. He did get dragged. I mean, he did die, unfortunately. I was in prison when it happened. I was in Art to Kill Correctional Facility when it happened. It was a tragic incident. The neighbor was a legitimate guy, did stupid things after the accident, had a barbecue in his yard, and Vicky, the mother, was distraught. She didn't like the idea that they were having barbecues in the yard, which I don't blame her. But when people say that John Gotti Sr. didn't have anything to do with this guy disappearing, that's a joke. We all know the truth. I know the truth. He knows the truth. They killed the guy. John Gotti, Fat Andy, Skinny Dom, these guys were killers, gangsters, scared to death to go on an airplane, scared to death to fly on an airplane. I used to tease my own man, you're a big gangster, you're trembling. We got to fly you to Florida, you're trembling. I have no control over that plane. I don't like it. And we always used to fly first class because my father used to tell me, if we're going to go down, we're going to go down in first class. So we always flew first class. They hated to fly. It's kind of funny that week, John Gotti and his wife took a plane trip to Florida on vacation, and the guy disappeared. You know what I mean? Like, come on. Guy ran me over. My father would kill the guy too. That's what mob guys did. They were killers. John Gotti was a killer. Fat Andy was a killer. Jeannie Gotti's a killer. They're killers. That's what they do. They have no qualms about it. And that guy was murdered. John Gotti had him murdered. John Gotti got permission to have him murdered. Because we tried to get permission. We had an incident with Anthony Stabile. He was a wise guy with the Lucchese family. He shot a friend of mine, Bobby, in my bar, the Polish bar. My father wanted to have him killed. We had sit-downs with Paulie Vario. He wouldn't give him up. My father actually went to O'Neill, who was the underboss, put it on record, went up the ladder to have Anthony Stabile killed because he shot my friend Bobby in the bar where me and my brother hung out. And it came down that we had to just take an apology. And my father's beef was that John got permission to kill a civilian, and he couldn't get permission to kill this guy, Anthony Stabile, who actually shot somebody and knows the rules. But in reality, my old man understood it because it was John's son. But politically, he felt that if John got permission to kill the neighbor, my father should have got permission to kill Anthony Stabile, because Anthony Stabile was a mob guy that knew the rules. The guy that hit, unfortunately, John's son was a civilian. I was friends with Angel. I was friends with her mother. I was friends with John, Senior, Junior, you know what I mean? And I don't want to talk, disrespect anybody, but that's what happened. We all know why the guy died and who was responsible. Like I said, I knew Johnny Elite since he was a kid. Johnny Elite was a great baseball player. He could have been a professional baseball player. He had scholarships out of high school, but he got hurt, and that was the end of his baseball career. But he was always a tough kid. Always had a lot of balls. I was in prison in 78 when he started hanging out with the Gottis. My brother, Albert, actually told him to stay away from them. And he talks about this, Johnny Elite. My brother Albert actually told him, stay away from him, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. My brother never liked John Gotti Jr., never liked him. They had arguments, never liked him. It was just one of those things. My brother never liked him. And he told Johnny Elite to stay away from him. It's funny because and we laugh about it, me and Johnny Elite. When I got out of jail in 80, he was already in the drug business, I believe, or just starting out. Maybe not in 80, maybe a little later on in 80, maybe a little later on into the 80s. And I used to tell my brother, how did this kid wind up with the Gottis when he's supposed to be with us? And we laugh about it. So anyway, he starts hanging out with John Gotti Jr. They become tight. They put together a little crew. And Johnny Elite starts selling drugs. He becomes a major drug dealer, making big money. And the three of them are partners. Who's the three partners? John Gotti Jr., Johnny Elite, and Ronnie One-Arm, who later became a captain in the Gambino family. I know this for a fact. Johnny Elite's hanging out in the spot at PM Pub. I'm going in there, and they're making crazy money. And Junior had an end. They were partners. They were best men at weddings. They baptized each other's kids. They were thick as thieves. He had an end with Johnny Elite all the time. He could deny it all he wants. Johnny Elite was his right-hand man. Johnny Elite committed homicides for him. Johnny Elite was his right-hand man. They made a ton of money. When John became the boss, Johnny Elite started staying by the PM Pub because now he's a known drug dealer. You're not supposed to be selling drugs in the mob, which is bullshit because everybody sold drugs. And he started staying by the PM Pub with Ronnie One-Arm and staying away from Junior. And that's how it all started. But he always had an end with Johnny Elite. Even when Johnny Elite started staying away from him, he always had an end. Always had an end. And then we all know what happened from there. They all got arrested in Florida. And that was the beginning of Junior's, all those trials that Junior got involved in. And Johnny Elite cooperated. Ronnie One-Arm just got out of prison. He did 21 years. John Jr. got hung juries. John Jr. got lucky because he got the trial moved from Tampa to New York. He got a new venue because if John Jr. would have went to trial in Tampa, he would have got convicted in front of that jury because the New York jury bought the victim act that he was a victim and they found him, and he got 3 hung juries and then the government just stopped prosecuting him. But that's the story with Johnny Elite. They were always partners. They were best friends. John Gotti took the money down with him. They both got rich together. And then John cooperated, and that was the end of that relationship. And now he just talks bad about him constantly and denies a lot of shit about their relationships. People always are intrigued about the Castellano hit. He said in the interview that Sammy had nothing to do with it. That's not true. Sammy was in on it. He was in on the planning. Sammy was in the car with John up the block. When I went to Arizona, Sammy gave me the whole rundown about who was in the restaurant and who pulled the triggers. And, he gave me the whole rundown. And I believe what Sammy told me. I believe Sammy was in the car with John when the hit went down. I believe Sammy was in on the planning of it from the day one because John Gotti and Angelo, they needed Sammy and DeChico, they needed them in on it because without them, they wouldn't have been able to pull it off because they set Paul up. So I believe Sammy's version of it. I don't believe anybody else's version of it. I believe Sammy's version of it. Sammy pleaded guilty to that murder. So, I wouldn't plead guilty to a murder I didn't commit. You know what I mean? So it's kind of odd that Sammy would plead guilty to a murder and had such knowledge of it if he wasn't in on it. Sammy actually performed his ceremony when he got made because John, who was the boss, didn't want to perform the ceremony for his own son. maybe because he felt it would be nepotism. So John actually was in Ozone Park with us when the ceremony took place. And we were actually waiting for Skinny Dom to come back from the city where the ceremony took place that Sammy performed. So how could these people not know Sammy when Sammy pricked his finger? Mikey Scars got straightened out that night. Skinny Dom got straightened out that night. John Jr. got straightened out that night. And maybe one or two other guys that I don't know. I don't remember their names. But Sammy did the ceremony. Yeah, I actually have episodes on my Patreon about Sammy performing the ceremony. If he was a nobody, Paul Castellano wouldn't have used him on the things he used him on, like the Johnny Keys hit out of Philadelphia, and a couple of other hits that he was involved in. If he was a nobody, he wouldn't have been put in those positions. And if he was a nobody, he wouldn't have became the underboss if he wasn't well liked, because they needed someone that could control Paul Castellano's guys in Brooklyn, and Sammy was that candidate after Frankie DeChico got blown up. We all have 302s. I cooperated. There's tons of I testified at 6 trials. So my 302s are could fill up this room probably. John Gotti Jr. testified for a couple of hours. I actually have the 302s. I read the 302s. It's more than one page that was shown on that interview. It's a couple of pages. The last page of the 302s that I have, he talks about the alleged suicide, I believe. He talks about other stuff. And in the last couple of paragraphs, he actually talks about Tony Lee, who was my father, Fat Andy's partner, and Sarial with the connections in the police department and his political connections. So there are 302s. He did proffer. I didn't do this to bash him. I'm just stating facts. I don't want to start no war of words with him. I don't dislike him. I'm not here to talk bad about him. I'm just here to tell what I know to be true, and let the people that see these interviews decide for themselves.